Hello everyone, my name is Eirik. Welcome back to Florence and back into my studio. Today we're going to continue our series on dynamic figure fusion, a technique of sculpture that lends itself to creating works like what Michelangelo was making a lot of the time, though we're certainly not going to reach nearly as high as he did with what we're doing here. It's the pursuit that matters, of course, so let's get into it. Observing from below the sculpture from time to time, or from above, depending on the sculpture you're working on, of course, can be really beneficial for this stage in the process. You'll see me do this from time to time, sitting on the floor and looking up at the work. The reason for this is that observing the work from below or above is the only way to observe the actual turn of the volumes. We can set borders like the outline of the abdomen from the side and where the abdomen meets the oblique from the front. But we can't observe the volume and how it turns from one border to the other unless we observe it from below. The clay is mostly applied at this stage using a tool, which is just a little modeling tool, sort of shaped roughly like a thumb, if you will. Though it doesn't really matter what type of tool you use. You should notice that most of the addition of clay, even though it's not modeling or rendering, is happening with the tool moving across the form. Clay is applied with the form, usually meaning in the longest direction of the form and then changing direction with the direction the form is meant to take as it moves up and down the body. While not always the case, applying clay with the form tends to work out rather well, I think. Any sort of application that's meant to introduce volume, meant to model form, or meant to render the surface to finish, any of those applications are going to happen with the tool for me and the clay working against the form. Against the direction that the clay was applied in when blocking in. Here is a Michelangelo drawing of a leg. I believe this is for Night from the new sacristy. And what you see here is that the leg is first probably outlined, and then he uses line to separate the internal information, the internal forms that exists within the leg, and this step in his process is quite evident in the calf region of the drawing. The lines for separating the forms travel in the direction of the outline, essentially up and down the leg, and in the longest direction of the muscles themselves, the forms themselves. The rendering shadows and creating a sense of forms turning away from the light, making the drawing seem three-dimensional. The marks used to do this travel across the forms, in the opposite direction of the lines used to separate the forms from each other. You can see good evidence of this in the thigh section or region of this drawing. We're using a similar idea here, and it works just as well in clay as it does in drawing. There is more to it, but knowing this for now is enough for where we're currently at in our sculpture. We will cover a more advanced version in the next video, which is going to be on modeling. We still need evidence of the bony masses to exist. Sometimes there are good opportunities to show the bony mass underneath the flesh, and where there is, I suggest you take it. For female figures, one that often pop up and is really useful is how the breast rests on top of the ribcage. Too often I see students letting the breast impact the form of the ribcage, which will destroy the illusion that the ribcage is hard and the breast is soft. This happens a lot with arms resting around or against the pelvis, or against the body in general, to be honest with you. Too often there is this awkward interaction because something that's meant to be hard, like the bones of the forearm, is impacted and bent by something soft, like the hips. Be very careful of this. One of the reasons I advocate for a really good ribcage at the start is because if dimensioned well, we won't need to grow it too much, which often leads to some awkward moments like the ones described above. Notice here how the breast is resting on top of the ribcage and follow the outline of the ribcage itself. Do consider material when sculpting. What is something made of, and what is what it's up against made of? Mistakes here can lead to some very weird looking things, so be very careful. The work we performed up until now is work that usually happens without the model present in the studio. At this time though, we have the model back in the studio, which is why you'll see an extra set of hands come into frame from time to time. I like to let my sculptures be in different places in the process at the same time. This means that I've done all the work previously seen in this video on the front, but the back is not quite ready to receive this kind of treatment yet. With our model back in the studio, we're going to go back to blocking in the forms of the back. You can see where we are starting out here in this photo, and this is where we are going to get at the end of the video. What you see in the before is a sculpture where the major positioning of stuff has been more or less figured out. Roughly figured out, I guess. For example, we have the position of the scapula present, but nothing really has been worked out around them or inside of them. For blocking in shapes like this, I really like to have good reference and preferably a model there to work from. If you can't get a model, then good reference will do, but there really is nothing better than working with a live model, I think. The live model offers variation as they shift slightly around, and they offer specificity that you can probably never come up with yourself. Working from a photo works as well, and I do that when I need to, but we have 3 dimensions here in our sculpture, and we have 3 dimensions with our model. And with the model, we can circle the work and observe more far faster than what we can from any photos. I would suggest getting some work done from life, at least a little bit, so you can get a taste of what it's like. Even if you're working mostly from photo reference, which is fine, I think a bit of live model work is going to inform how you work from photos in a positive way. So it's definitely something to try to have happen. How do we keep the back from becoming flat and boring? Especially the upper back, since that's where we're going to be working mostly here. A lot of these problems come from the setup of the bones. A lot of the problems of flatness, especially around the scapulus and the clavicles as well, these issues come from the setup of the bones themselves, I believe. And in this region, of course, it's the bone of the scapula itself that can mess things up for us. Notice here how there is an angle break to the scapula itself, the spine of the scapula that is. And the reason we can see this from this particular angle is because we're sort of looking down at the scapula, a little bit, at an angle for sure. The function of the scapula is to slide across the ribcage, allowing our arms a lot of movement. This means that they have a shape that somewhat follows the shape of the ribcage itself. The ribcage is a rounded form, and the scapula is a rounded bone that follows the roundness of the ribcage. In other words, the scapula is not flat. Most of the scapula is hidden beneath muscle, but at the spine its shape is visible on the surface of most models and in most poses. By creating a scapula that has this angle break built into it from the beginning, we get a lot of depth here for free. Or there is potential to get more of it for free at least. Understanding and building the bones first, and then letting the fleshy forms around them follow along with their logic, can be a very good way to keep your work from becoming too flat. We can also create a lot of depth by understanding where one form starts, and where it then subsequently ends. Origin and insertion. Some forms begin at the medial edge of the scapula and they aim deep in towards the head of the humerus, for example. Some muscles will then do the opposite, and so they will aim in different directions, creating depth. Understanding what we're sculpting, where the forms are headed, is going to help if nothing else. Observing from below can also help, of course, but the application of logic is something that I never think we can get or use enough of. Too often, students who work too much from life start to rely on visual observation to an extent that I think is damaging to their overall abilities as sculptors. Instead of becoming thinking sculptors, they become overly reliant on what they see in front of them and treat things as flat. Both eyes and the brain must work together in order to achieve the best result possible. The anatomy of the upper back that we're dealing with here is going to be the two scapulas, of course, and the C7 vertebra seen here. These are the bones that we're dealing with. Around those, we're going to have the trapezius muscle, which is a large and complex and often appears as many broken forms, like it's not one muscle, but many. I try to create delineation that is more intense along its borders and not so intense in the interior of the form itself. This way, it's communicated that the trapezius is one form with a lot of variation inside of it. A big variation which I always look for is this line right here, which is caused by a muscle called the rhomboids, which lies underneath the trapezius muscle. Sometimes knowing the layers of muscle and how they impact each other impact the surface, at least in some regions where it's more prominent than others, can be a good idea. Inside the scapulus, we're going to be working with the infraspinatus and the teres major. There is a smaller form here as well called the teres minor, but it's rarely visible or more visible in poses where the arms are extended forwards or upwards. Here the shoulders are pushed back and the scapulus are therefore closer to the spine, sort of mushing up a bunch of the forms and hiding the teres minor. Even though the anatomy is not that complex, I guess, there is a lot of complex layering of muscles going on here, and bone as well, and I find that the variation in this area depending on the pose can be very great. Working from life, therefore, becomes a great boon since I can take advantage of that variation and create a very unique and naturalistic result. That's it for today's video. Next time, we'll finish up consolidating forms and we'll start down the path of modeling form. This means next time the sculpture is going to get its surface unified completely, or at least begin to get it unified. And you'll finally get to see what I mean by how easy that step is if we've done the work leading up to it well. Thank you for watching until the end of the video. I hope you learned a thing or two that you can take with you into your own practice. Until next time, stay creative.